Article 2 of the United States Constitution establishes the Electoral College. Each state's laws provide that electors are to be chosen by a popular vote. And on December 14th, 2020, electors met in all 50 states and the District of Columbia to cast their votes. Joseph Biden won by a margin of 306 to 232. The election was over. Mr. Biden was the president-elect. Before the Electoral College met, Donald Trump and his allies filed dozens of legal challenges to the election, but they lost over and over again, including in front of multiple judges President Trump had nominated to the bench. In many of these cases, the judges were highly critical of the arguments put forward, explaining that no genuine evidence of widespread fraud had been presented. For example, a federal judge in Pennsylvania said, "This court has been presented with strained legal arguments without merit and speculative accusations unsupported by evidence. In the United States of America, this cannot justify the disenfranchisement of a single voter, let alone all the voters of its sixth most populated state." On December 15th, after the Electoral College certified the outcome, the Republican majority leader in the Senate acknowledged Mr. Biden's victory.
Yesterday, electors met in all 50 states. So as of this morning, our country has officially a president-elect and a vice president-elect. Many millions of us had hoped the presidential election would yield a different result. But our system of government has processes to determine who will be sworn in on January the 20th. The Electoral College has spoken. So today I want to congratulate President-elect Joe Biden.
Even members of President Trump's cabinet and his White House staff understood the significance of his losses in the courts and the absence of evidence of fraud. They also respected the constitutional certification by the Electoral College. Many of them told President Trump that it was time to concede the election to Mr. Biden. For example, then Secretary of Labor Gene Scalia, an accomplished lawyer and the son of late Justice Scalia, called President Trump in mid-December and advised him to concede and accept the rulings of the courts.
And so I had to put a call into the president. I might have called on the 13th. We spoke, I believe, on the 14th, in which I conveyed to him that I thought that it was time for him to acknowledge that President Biden had prevailed in the election. But I communicated to the president that when that legal process is exhausted and when the electors have voted, that's the point at which that outcome needs to be expected. I told him that I did believe, yes, that once those legal processes were run, if fraud had not been established that had affected the outcome of the election, then unfortunately I believed that what had to be done was concede the outcome.
As you've seen in prior hearings, President Trump's Justice Department, his White House staff, and his campaign officials were repeatedly telling him that there was no evidence of fraud sufficient to change the outcome of the election. And last week, we conducted an 8-hour interview with President Trump's White House counsel, Pat Cipollone. You'll see a number of excerpts of that interview today and even more in our next hearing. Mr. Cipollone told us that he agreed with the testimony that there was no evidence of fraud sufficient to overturn the election.
I want to start by asking if you agree, Mr. Cipollone, with the conclusions of Matt Morgan, of Bill Barr, of all of the individuals who evaluated those claims, that there is no evidence of election fraud sufficient to undermine the outcome in any particular state.
Yes, I agree with that.
And Mr. Cipollone also specifically testified that he believed that Donald Trump should have conceded the election.
Did you believe, Mr. Cipollone, that the president should concede once you made the determination based on the investigations that you credited DOJ did and the campaign did? Did you, in your mind, form a belief that the president should concede the election loss at a certain point after the election?
Well, again, I was the White House counsel. Some of those decisions are political, so to the extent that, but if your question is, did I believe he should concede the election at a point in time? Yes, I did. I believe Leader McConnell went onto the floor of the Senate, I believe in mid-December, and basically said, the process is done. That would be in line with my thinking on these things.
As Attorney General Bill Barr testified, December 14th should have been the end of the matter.
December 14th was the day that the states certified their votes and sent them to Congress. And in my view, that was the end of the matter. I didn't see, I thought that this would lead inexorably to a new administration.
Mr. Cipollone also testified that the president's chief of staff, Mark Meadows, said he shared this view.
As early as that November 23rd meeting, we understand that there was discussion about the president possibly conceding the election. And specifically, we understand that Mark Meadows assured both you and Attorney General Barr that the president would eventually agree to a graceful exit. Do you remember Mr. Meadows making any such representation?
Are you saying as part of that meeting or separately? Again, without getting into that meeting, I would say that is a statement and a sentiment that I heard from Mark Meadows.
I see. And again, do you know if it was on November 23rd or some point?
Again, it was probably, around that time, and it was probably subsequent to that time. It wasn't a one-time statement.
Mr. Meadows has refused to testify, and the committee is in litigation with him. But many other White House officials shared the view that once the litigation ended and the Electoral College met, the election was over. And here's President Trump's former press secretary.
I wanted to clarify, Ms. McEnany, so back to my previous question, it was your view then, or was it your view that the efforts to overturn the election should have stopped once the litigation was complete?
In my view, upon the conclusion of litigation was when I began to plan for life after the administration.
And this is what Ivanka Trump told us.
December 14th was the day on which the Electoral College met, when these electors around the country met and cast the electoral votes consistent with the popular vote in each state. And it was obviously a public proceeding or a series of proceedings that President Biden had obtained the requisite number of electors. Was that an important day for you? Did that affect sort of your planning or your realization as to whether or not there was going to be an end of this administration?
I think so. I think it was my sentiment probably prior as well.
Judd Deere was a White House deputy press secretary. This was his testimony about what he told President Trump.
I told him that my personal viewpoint was that the Electoral College had met, which is the system that our country is set under to elect a president and vice president. And I believed at that point that the means for him to pursue litigation was probably closed.
And you recall what his response, if any, was?
He disagreed.